Ooh, that's not good. That's definitely not good. All right, let's go. Welcome back to Weekend Watch Repair. My name's Adam, and we have here the case of the cursed Doxa. This watch is something else, ladies and gentlemen. We have here Doxa, I'm guessing from the 1940s. Uh, Purely speculative on my part based on everything I've read. Picked this thing up on eBay a while back. Just thought it was a cool watch, had some character. I thought the age dial was pretty neat, and I, for some reason, really liked that trace line on the dial where you could tell the hour hand had rubbed it at some point. Doing some quick initial checks here, and ooh, well, we got an issue here. I've got the crown pulled out, and I can see the seconds hand kind of barely moving when I try to move the hands. You see that seconds hand moving, and then it stops when I'm. Yeah, that's not right. Go ahead and give this thing a wind, and what I'm feeling here is actually absolutely nothing. I feel no resistance. There's no click, no nothing when we wind this thing. Possibly have a broken mainspring, which is going to be the least of our problems on this watch. But let's go ahead and take a better look at it. Outside of it being very dirty, I just thought this watch had a lot of character. It's not a necessarily a big watch, typical for a men's watch at the time, but again, kind of small by today's standards. Definitely small for my larger wrist, but I still like it nonetheless. And I thought the case back on it was super cool. Although it's got some pretty serious gouges in it. It looks like a watch of this age should be. So my initial suspicion was that this was a radium dial or radium hands, and I've got this radiation detector here, and the reason I'm showing you this is so you can not spend the money and make the mistake I did on buying this piece of junk. I've had this thing for a while. I could never get a solid reading on anything, even on watches that I was absolutely positive were radioactive. So what I did was eventually dumped that thing and got a different one. I actually recorded this on the 4th of July. So what you're hearing in the background is a bunch of fireworks going off outside. But I wanted to put the clicking in here from this thing. And you can tell we've definitely got some, this is radioactive. So we're going to go ahead and take the proper precautions. We have pre-loosened the case back. So now we're just use our little 8-ball here to go ahead and get this case back off. Pretty sure that thing's going to get a hole punctured in it at some point. It's I've about worn that thing out. You can see all that gunk that came off there just from turning the case, and check this out. Wow. I mean, it's not like I don't know what's coming. I made this video, but dang, look at all that rust. Well, to its credit, so what we have here, we have this shield, which I've read is they used for magnetic resistance, but it also forms a real tight bond to the movement ring, and clearly, it did its job with this gasket that is so hilariously beyond its service life. It's laughable, but you can tell. Look at what's around the case and look what's not in the case. For the most part, rust. So kudos to it. It did its job, but wow, that's a lot of corrosion. Okay. Yeah, I just had to get a different shot just because I was kind of marveling at it in myself. So to begin disassembly, we're going to loosen the setting lever screw and we can go ahead and pull our crown and stem out. Pretty straightforward on that. Unfortunately, that crown's kind of got it crimped in on the back side of it. It's not the easiest thing in the world to change gaskets on those. But we'll go ahead and flip this thing around and take a look at this thing. So right now, once we have this exposed, I am wearing uh, a, a appropriate mask, and I've kind of got some ventilation going in the room because we do know that this is radioactive. There's a lot of concern, especially with people wearing watches. And again, I'm not some scientific person. I don't necessarily, I'm not going to speak with any sort of authority about radioactive watches and, between alpha and beta and gamma and, reading the radium versus the radon gas and what you're actually picking up and all that stuff. But I've done quite a bit of reading on the subject personally, but I'm not going to come on here and spout off what one should or shouldn't do. I know what I'm doing and I'm taking proper precautions, but it's exposure is very limited. Obviously, I'm taking every step I can to not inhale any of this stuff. So checking for radium on just the dial itself, and it looks like we have radioactive hands. That dial, I mean, that's a negligible reading. So that's good news. We can go ahead, and the first thing I noticed here when we took this thing apart was that the setting lever spring was broken, and that was definitely a problem. Now we can go ahead and begin disassembly of this front side of the watch. This here is going to be pretty typical. This is not necessarily an overly complicated movement. It's a gorgeous movement. This particular movement is labeled as a Doxa 11 and a half C14, 11 and a half being the size and line, movement C14. There's quite a bit of marking on that minute wheel, just from where lubrication is kind of ground its way in there as that thing is rotated. And try as I might, I mean, the wheel's still in good shape, but I scrubbed that thing by hand for 30 minutes. I could not get most of those marks out. Come in here, we can go ahead and remove our cannon pinion. It comes off pretty easily. And we have one screw securing the setting lever spring. Pretty standard stuff in here. Again, if this is not your first video, this keyless works and motion work is going to look pretty familiar to you. Although this watch does have, a lot of cap jewels, it's non-shock protected, so we're going to have to deal with a lot of in stones and all that fun stuff that gets associated with that. Bead errors, quite a journey to get sorted on these as well, so we got that ahead of us. But getting that yoke spring out, that thing was buried in there pretty deep, but we finally managed to persuade it to come out, and now we can pull our yoke out. That yoke is what moves that sliding clutch back and forward as you pull out or push in the crown to engage the winding side of the things or the timing side, time setting side of things of the movement. Here's our winding pinion. There we go. And in order to get that setting lever out of there, what we have to do is unscrew the screw from the other side of the movement, and you can see that setting lever just falls out. And I'm trying this movement holder. I picked this up. I've seen these in a few other videos. Mike with My Retro Watches. I love that guy's channel. I just watched his long, I think it was a Longines, but he was going to do a balance staff, and my heart just sank because I know that guy's been wanting to do one on his channel, and it was a beautifully made video because, I mean, the guy shows you his failures. I'm going to show you one of my failures in this video too, but I mean, just a great video. He just posted it the other day. You should really go watch it. And I only bring that up because I've seen him use a similar movement holder to this, and so I ordered one just to see, although the collets on that movement holder aren't necessarily the right size, it doesn't really hold this particular movement all that great. So I wanted to go ahead and get the spring out of here, and I was going to flip this balance over so I could push out the stud for the hairspring, and the darn thing just kind of popped out on its own. I was trying to get situated to pop it out with a small tool, but it decided to come out on its own, so that was convenient. But now we can go ahead and disassemble this balance cock. So these two screws that hold this in are going to be holding in the capstone setting, which that and the regulator arm are going to kind of come off as a unit, and those two pieces kind of fit inside one another. So we'll get these two screws out of there, and these are just absolutely teeny tiny screws. I'm zoomed way in on this footage here. We'll get those two screws out of the way. We want to go ahead and separate these and run these through the wash removed. Otherwise, you can leave them screwed in, but even when they come out of the wash, if you have those together, you could look through them with a backlight and you'll still see some dirt and whatnot, but in there, it doesn't do a great job cleaning it. So I like to, even if I'll have the balance on the movement, I'll remove the cap jewels. It just gets a better clean on everything. There we go. There's our balance disassembled. And the regulating arms are extremely delicate on that, so I'll actually clean that by hand. I won't run that through the machine. But I want to go ahead and just check in shake while I'm in here. And, I really want to act surprised, but, I know it's coming. Check that escape wheel out, folks. I figured, what the heck, I was surprised when I first saw it, but I was like, well, we're in here, so I'm going to go ahead and check in shake anyway, and we'll leave the footage in here. But take a look at that escape wheel. That's unreal. But I'm checking, and we'll get into that in great detail later, but we're just checking in, checking everything else, checking the movement on the pallet fork here. And everything that, nothing seems to be kind of out of place a little bit. One thing I didn't really show there is I was checking the wheels for, trueness as well by spinning the gear train. And it looks like that fourth wheel especially was out around a little bit. So we're going to go ahead and disassemble the rear side of the watch first, or next. So what we have here is our ratchet wheel coming off, and pay attention to the condition of that thing, because I'm gonna screw this watch up and put a big old mark in it later. We got a heck of a lot of side shake on that barrel arbor, so we're going to need to address that. But yeah, one of these things, and I'll go ahead and kind of give you some context on this video, because all this, if you've watched any number of videos on my channel or elsewhere, most of the next couple minutes of footage is not going to be anything you haven't already seen in some form or fashion. But there is a challenge putting this video together, because this watch I've actually assembled, I think, 3 complete times at this point. And I mean, I'll go ahead and give you a spoiler. At the end of this video, we have this watch running, and we do successfully finish all the repairs. But I had to shelve this project for a while because I was waiting on some parts, one of them being that escape wheel. I'll get into that in a bit, but finding a Doxa C14 escape wheel isn't it's donor C14 movement isn't the easiest thing in the world. And I'll kind of, well, I guess I can get into it now, but most of the reference material I found on this said this thing shares, it's the same base movement as an ETA 1080, which it really looks like it is. So I got one of those escape wheels, but it is not actually the same, and I found that out the hard way. So there was a lot of time waiting on parts, and then towards the end of the whole process, I screwed something up and basically had to start over, which I will go into detail later on. But out comes our pallet fork. There's an issue with that I will find later. I didn't really notice it at the time right there, but at deep inspection later, we have a problem with that pallet fork. Now we can get off our train wheel bridge. And these have really tight posts on there. The alignment posts on these, very tight posts and very long posts. So kind of wedging this thing loose, even once we kind of get clear of the pivots, for the most part, it's still like we got to work this thing up quite a bit before we can get it high enough to remove the plate. But we finally decide to, get it to a point where it goes. And there's that darn movement holder acting up on me. That collet that it's in is labeled for a ETA 2824, but it was super close. So I've tried to use it, and check that out. I think they call that verdigris. That is corrosion. That's you'll see on copper and brass, and like, so this is a brass plate, which brass is what is it? Brass is an alloy of copper and zinc, and you'll see that green patina, some call it, on like the Statue of Liberty or anything copper. You'll see that on that's like powdered verdigris, I believe, is what we're seeing right there. Kind of funny how it all clumps up into that one little spot. Taking a look at that escape wheel that is going to be beyond my ability to save. Next thing we can do is go ahead and remove this bridge for the center wheel. And it actually looks like I somehow magnetized my screwdriver. And what's funny, I was, during this time, I was like, man, I need to go ahead and demagnetize that, because, generally speaking, you don't want, magnetism when you're working on a watch, but technically for disassembly, who cares? And it actually made the process of taking the screws out quite easy. So I didn't necessarily mind it right there. So I actually left it alone for the time being. But I was having a little bit of difficulty getting this plate up. I had to, go into negotiations with it for a bit before it decided to come off. Come on. There we go. All right. That thing's out of the way. And we got to go ahead and take our barrel bridge off before we can get our center wheel off. This barrel bridge is going to be held on by 2 screws, and there we go. You see my magnetized screwdriver, and I don't necessarily mind that at this point in the process. Now we can lever this thing up as well. And again, really tight fitting and really long posts on the underside of this bridge to fit it into the main plate. So just got to persuade these bridges a little bit, but I'm trying my best to not bend them, to be gentle. All right. Bridge can come off. There's our setting lever screw. That's the screw we turn to release the setting lever from the opposite side of the movement. And lastly, we can finish up with our mainspring barrel and the center wheel. There we go. Continuing on disassembly, we're going to go ahead and take a look at this mainspring because we have the suspicion that this thing was broken. So we'll go ahead and separate the lid from the drum. And yeah, that thing is most certainly broken. We're going to go ahead and pull this arbor out here and we'll give you a shot just to kind of show you a little bit. I'm not using the tweezers I normally use, so I have to fight with the thing a little bit. But the arbor comes out. Now, take a look at that thing. Right there on the arrow, you can see where that mainspring is broken. So the inner coil actually just pulls out with a pair of tweezers. No big deal. And now we can go ahead and unwind this mainspring the rest of the way. Really pretty old school mainspring. This is an original old school type of mainspring. But it has reached the end of its service life. There's our inner piece. And now we need to go ahead and remove all these cap jewels. So on this movement, on the back side of the movement, or the dial side of the movement rather, we're going to have cap jewels for the balance and for the escape wheel on the main plate itself. And it's going to be the same process on all those. What I am doing though is just, generally speaking, I'm not actually sure if all the screws are the same. The actual cap jewel plates have a pretty unique shape, and it wouldn't be difficult to determine where those go, but I'm going to go ahead and storing those and labeling them separately just to keep all the screws with the same plates and everything else, just to avoid any confusion later. And what I noticed here is we have a interesting little setting for the hole jewel. So we have that spring cap and then that spring and jewel assembly. So we'll go ahead and get that out. Now on the center wheel bridge, we have this, and this isn't necessarily a cap jewel. So the center wheel actually doesn't interact with that jewel at all. It interacts with the bridge beneath that. And that jewel is what the base of the fourth wheel is going to sit on. And that way it separates it from the center wheel. Our cap jewel for the escape wheel on the back side of the movement is going to be on our train wheel bridge. We can go ahead and get that one out of the way. You notice here how they polish the ones that are on the back side of the watch that would be visible with the case back removed, but the ones on the front side of the watch that are hidden by the dial are not polished. And we're just taking a look at the condition of the jewels inside this thing. So I want to kind of give you a very clear, idea of what the condition of this plate looked like, what the jewels looked like. Here we're taking a look at the wheel train bridge. I guess you can tell which one of those things was for the escape wheel. Not hard to tell on that. But we're going to go ahead and begin, and I'm just going to go ahead and peg out all these jewels, start my pre-cleaning routine. I'm sure you've seen that in other videos. Pegging out all the jewels on the other side of the jewels on the flat side, kind of scraping all that gunk away with pegwood, just like you see right there. Taking a look at the pivots on these things, we're going to kind of start off and show you the condition of all these pivots. What we're looking at is the balance here. There's our center wheel. Zooming in here, that's our fourth wheel, and we got a fair amount of rust on the pinion and on the post there on that center wheel. Same problem with the third wheel. Yeah, we got some pivot problems here. And what I'm using here is a generic version of E-Flex. That's a silicone polishing stick. That's the extra fine grit. So a little bit of work on that, and that's what our balance pivots actually come out looking like, and that's even before cleaning, so I'm super thrilled with that. We'll go through that process, and I'm checking wheel flatness here. Wanted to show you this fourth wheel. I'm trying to identify a low spot, and you can see right there on the far left side of that, we got that low spot, so I'm kind of Once I identify that low spot, I kind of work it around. I did most of the adjustments off camera, and then I was like, I need to throw a couple of these things on camera. So I'll identify the low spot and then rotate it around. Just use my tweezers to make it tiny little adjustments. They actually make a little wrench that is for that purpose. I don't have one of those, but I found that little tweezer kind of technique works pretty well. Yeah, that looks like maybe a little bit of a low spot right there. Yeah. So I'm going to go ahead and tweak it just a hair, tiny, tiny little increments, and I'll continue to work this around. That's not the final adjustment, and that's actually straight enough where it would function okay. But you can work this thing until to reach the level of perfection you're happy with. It's honestly kind of hard to stop doing it once you start. But after pre-cleaning, I'm pretty pleased with how these things turned out. That fourth wheel looked pretty flat there. Our center wheel cleaned up quite nicely. Very pleased with that. However, our escape wheel is a whole other matter. I actually took a stab at trying to clean up all the rust on there because I just wanted to see what I could do. And now I was just checking roundness of it after I cleaned up as much as I could. There's too much pitting on the pinions to use this, but it's a shame because that escape wheel is just dead true and not out of, it's not out of flat, but it's just, I can't use it. There's just too much pitting in the rust. So next thing we're going to do in the repair is to kind of tighten up all that looseness we had in the upper barrel arbor port. So on my staking set, I have domed upper and lower punches. And what I'm doing is I'm just using very light taps. You can kind of see that wheel or that plate vibrating a little bit. Very light taps. And with the dome punches on the upper and lower side, it's going to squeeze that metal inwards. And the goal is to make that hole smaller than the outside diameter of that upper barrel arbor. So I'm just going to test fit on the arbor and see if it goes through the hole in the plate. And sure enough, it does not, which is actually what we want. So now what I can do is use a smoothing broach. And what we're going to do is use that smoothing broach. It'll open up that hole, and it'll also kind of burnish it and work harden it a little bit. So I'm just going to show you the full process. That's how much I use the smoothing broach on the very first step. And just doing a quick test fit. Now the arbor does go through, but I can immediately tell it's way too tight. I almost kind of had to force it into place. So if I lift that bridge plate off, that barrel should not come with it. So it's kind of squeezed in there right now. So I can already tell that's still way too tight. So we'll go ahead and open it up just a hair more. And I'm broaching it from the top side of the plate. And the idea is, since that's obviously a tapered rod, it would, if it does create an oil sink, it would create a very slight oil sink. So I've got the bridge put back on, and we have the most microscopic amount of movement. That's actually not enough in my opinion. So one tiny little adjustment here, just, you know, 3 or 4 turns. That's really it. And then we'll go ahead and see what this looks like. So we'll just keep this in one shot. Go ahead and pop the bridge back into place if I can align it properly. And I will tighten this down with the screws just to make sure it's in its final place before I test it. We'll zoom in, and now we'll take a look at this thing, and you see how much room more, just that 3 or 4 turns, how much more movement that played, but it's still nowhere near what it was, but it's definitely tighter, but we still have a little bit of free movement in there. I like that. I'm going to use this opportunity right now to check end shake as well. Although there's no jewels really to adjust, so we almost kind of stuck with what we got, but end shake actually looks pretty darn good. So I'm pleased with that. Closer inspection of the pallet fork found the entry stone. See how it's misaligned? That is going to cause problems with its interaction with the escape wheel. So I wanted to go ahead and source a new pallet fork. So here, like we were talking about earlier, we got our replacement ETA 1080 escape wheel. And at this point, I'd been waiting like a month, and I assembled it, started to assemble it, found out it didn't work. And here's why. Here's our original escape wheel, and you can see that is 8/100ths of a millimeter. Our new one, the pivot, is 10/100ths of a millimeter. And you may be thinking, oh, it's only 2/100ths of a millimeter. That shouldn't be that big of a deal. So what we have here is the hole jewel out of the train wheel bridge for the escape wheel. Here's our original escape wheel, and you can see that thing fits on that jewel just fine, no problems. On our replacement escape wheel, and this escape wheel, dimension wise, the diameter of the wheel, height, everything, it was all good. The pivots were just too thick. That doesn't go on there. And that 2/100ths of a millimeter is the difference between working and not working. And that 2/100ths of a millimeter that's your side shake on that thing. And that is no good. So what we have here, this was a solution after I gave up trying to find a legit Doxa C14 escape wheel because clearly they're different. This is a main plate for an ETA 1080. And what I also found in that escape wheel learning curve is that the pallet fork had the exact same problem with the pivots. So I have this ETA 1080 donor movement. It was a complete junk movement. I got off eBay. I took a gamble and hoping it would work. And what I found was that the cap jewels, the uh, were the exact same size in the plates, but they had the right inside diameter. So I'm going to use the cap jewels and hole jewels for both the escape wheel and for the pallet fork, bridges, and main plate. And we're going to swap all that stuff out and move forward with that. Except on the pallet fork, I'm just going to use the entire pallet fork bridge. And we're going to have to readjust in shake on everything when we do it. But that's my workaround for this. And that took about a month to figure out, trying to source parts and waiting and finding things that didn't want to work right and everything else. And that's what I decided to go with when I finally found that the jewels in the ETA 1080, although they have a different inside diameter, have the same outside diameter. So we're going to use those settings in place so we can use those other parts for this watch and get this watch going. So we go ahead, and you saw me stack up all the parts. This here is my Elmo cleaning machine. This has 1 wash cycle, 3 rinse cycles, and a drying cycle. It's a super nice machine, although it is quite a bit of overkill for me. If you've watched a lot of my videos in the past, I tried to put this newer footage together, add a little slow-mo in there for you, so I hope you don't mind, but I think it looks pretty cool. Using this opportunity to say thanks to my patrons. I really appreciate you. Our newest member, I know I'm gonna butcher your name here. I don't know if it's Case or Sace or Cease. I do not know how to pronounce your name, sir, but thank you so much for joining. I hope you got a good laugh out of my inability to pronounce your name, but I really appreciate you joining nevertheless. If you're interested in supporting the channel, you can do so over there, and you don't have to be a paying member as well. I upload a lot of content for just free members as well, show you what I'm working on. So thanks again, everybody. So folks, what we're looking at here is, in full disclosure, is basically the third time, second complete time assembling this watch. Third time, even doing a partial assembly. So we have a replacement mainspring, which we knew we were definitely going to need there. So we're going to go ahead and get this thing installed. We got it installed, adding some HP 1300 here for the base, and we'll go ahead and install our arbor and go ahead and get this thing put together. The reason I'm doing this now, because I originally, I found the escape wheel issue during the first assembly attempt. And then when we get past the escape wheel assembly, and I'll go ahead and tell you now, because eventually we're going to get there and it'll provide you some context. I screwed up the balance on this watch. I did. And, well, I say screw it up. I lost it. As funny as that may sound. Oh, there's your click, by the way. Someone told me to put the click in the video, so there you go. What happened was, I got this thing going and going through the process of adjusting beat error. And real quick, you didn't see me you saw me only disassemble one of these two, but here's how those assemblies in the cap for the balance assembly go. And that little spring and hole jewel assembly, and then the little C clip has to fit under a lip inside of that thing. So you kind of got to get them wedged in there in the right spot. And I took my learning curve on the balance cock here, and then the main plate went a lot more smoothly. So I had the balance complete off, which is the balance wheel and the hairspring, and I was doing beat error adjustments. And it was, in the evening. I can't remember what time. It was real quiet. I didn't have the TV on. It was eerily quiet at my workbench. And I'm sitting there making my adjustments, and I made the adjustment, picked the movement up by the hairspring stud with my tweezers, and my phone, just off to the left of me by a few feet. That really loud, obnoxious intentionally obnoxious loud alarm, like when you have an alert, like a silver alert or amber alert, or some sort of urgent public notice. It just out of the blue from a dead quiet room, and I've got this balance in my hand, and I kind of flinched real quick, and I look at my phone, and that spring just popped out of my tweezers, the whole balance assembly. And I tell you, I have searched the whole, everything. I've moved cabinets around. I have found like the tiniest part I lost a year and a half, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, earlier on in my journey. I found a part. By comparison, that balance wheel is huge. I still can't find it. I've took a magnet over that whole room. I can't find it. So what you're looking at here is a replacement balance complete. And unfortunately, it's not brass like the original one. I was kind of hoping it was. And I believe this is not the correct one, but it is the correct dimensions. There were a few different balance complete assemblies for this thing. And I believe, even though they say it was the right one, this one is for an ETA 1080 with Inca block. But I was looking at the staff, comparing it to photos from this video earlier and earlier footage I took. It looked identical, with the difference of it has a blue impulse jewel instead of a red, typical, and the wheel is not brass. So, but other than that, everything looked fine. So we're going with this different balance. And that's why at that point, when I lost that balance and I got the new one, and I said, you know what? I'm going to just start filming over completely. I'm going to take everything apart, re-clean it, just assemble it front to back again, and then at least provide that context to the viewer. Because if you saw me remove a brass balance wheel and put in a steel balance wheel without context as to why, it would be a bit confusing. And so I was like, you know what? It would just make everything flow a bit more smoothly if I just explain how I screwed it up and go on from there. So that one was my fault. The cost of that balance complete assembly is totally on me. And to this day, I still can't find that part. I'm convinced, like I've ripped a fabric in space time, and there is a legit portal to a different dimension in my workshop because I can't find it anywhere. Oh, but anyway, so we're going ahead, and I'm oiling this watch here kind of the old fashioned way without my automatic oiler, just to kind of show you. And that little oiler I have, it's tiny, and so it does tiny amounts, but I'm just kind of using multiple drops until I get the size dot that I like, which is, I like that right there. And so I'm trying to be very, very careful turning this thing over, because I don't want to disturb that oil drop that is now on the underside of that jewel. So once I kind of get it remotely over that hole, you can kind of make fine adjustments and move it around slightly, and you're okay. So we got that in, oiled, and everything's good to go. The one thing you don't see me do here, you obviously see jewels in here for the pallet fork, and you see that's a different color jewel in that capstone setting. So when I was testing the pallet fork jewels and the escape wheel jewels to see if they fit, I was so intrigued by I didn't hit record, because if it didn't work, I was going to figure out another solution. But when I, found that they were the right size, I just got totally engaged with the work. I pushed out the old jewels, pushed in, got the new jewels in, and then went through and set in shake on everything. And I was like, man, I didn't really film that part. So what you're seeing here, it looks like I never pulled them out. But if you pay attention, that capstone for that pallet fork jewel on the front side of the main plate is a different color. This one here is a red color, just like the old one, but that's from the ETA 1080. Movement actually, that it cleaned up quite nice. But we're going to go ahead and dump a little dab of 9010 on this, and go ahead and set that as well. And so I went through and again reset the depth of those hole jewels on everything, escape wheel and pallet fork, just to make sure that in shake was where I wanted it to be. Now we can go ahead and get that installed. All right. Now that all that prep work's done, we can actually put this movement together. We're starting off by applying a little HP 1300 to the main plate. And now we can install our center wheel. Get that put into place. A little bit more of that same lubrication into the main plate for our mainspring barrel. And there we go. We can slide that thing into place. And a little bit on the top side of that center wheel. because we're going to go ahead and put this bridge on. And it's a little bit more difficult to lubricate this one once that bridge is in place. But go ahead and fight this thing. It's not sat down all the way, so I'm just kind of massaging it, trying to get it down to where it needs to go. Then we can go ahead and pop our 2 screws in there and get this thing tightened up. Next thing we want to do is go ahead and put in this jewel here for the 4th wheel. And it's a pretty tight squeeze, actually. And there you got to trying to line it up just right. When I finally do, it'll pop into place. I just got to fiddle with it for a minute, so bear with me as I do it. But there we go. And one teeny tiny little screw holding that in place. Some more HP 1300 for the upper barrel arbor port. You could lubricate it there. You could lubricate it once you put the bridge on as well. But I just decided to do it there and a little bit in the hole there where the setting lever screw is going to go. And that screw is super easy to forget, but a pain in the neck if you actually do forget it, because then you got to take the whole darn thing off just to put that screw back in, because even though it's visible from the top side of the barrel bridge, it is not removable. There we go. Get that bridge put into place, make sure that thing's pushed all the way down, and we can go ahead and get those 2 screws in this thing tightened up. Now we have our ETA 1080 escape wheel. And again, I mean, so basically on the repairs, what we ended up doing, since I couldn't find, an original C14 Doxa escape wheel, all the documentation says this should be the exact same escape wheel, and dimension-wise, on everything but the pivots, it is. But that pivot's a deal breaker. And I think I could have actually gotten away with, if I really wanted to, using a 1080, bridge or something. I don't know. But I wanted to keep that, use as much original parts as possible, but it was a compromise. I actually found a Doxa C14 donor movement that would have had the correct size pivots on that escape wheel and on the pallet fork, but it was $300+. I just flat out refused to pay that for a donor movement for something I see people pay that for Valjoux movements. I'm not, not an old ETA movement. I just, no thanks. So came up with the solution. So we got the turn wheel bridge on, and sure enough, it does not want to go. And sure enough, it's always the darn escape wheel. So my shaky hands and all, trying to get this thing lined up. Sometimes you can kind of give that 4th wheel a little spin and that escape wheel will kind of find its home, but it just does not want to go. So I'm zoomed in. If you take a look at that cap jewel, you'll see that escape wheel. Right there. Do you see where that pivot fell into place and that escape wheel sat down where it should? There we go. Now we can give this wheel a turn, and yep, it's spinning. So good deal. With the, the locating pins on the underside of that train wheel bridge, the tapping trick is really kind of ineffective on this particular movement. So we kind of had to do it the old-fashioned way right there. But 2 screws in and we're good to go. So now we can go ahead and get our click assembly put together. So we have this tiny little spring here with 2 90-degree bends going in opposite directions on each end. And a little bit of lubrication for the post where that click is going to rotate. Get that popped into place. And then there's 1 screw holding that whole assembly down. Next thing I want to do is I want to apply some heavy grease to the point where that spring is going to interact with the click itself. So just trying to put a tiny little dab on the edge right there. And we'll just kind of work that click a little bit. And then we can clean up the excess. Okay, I screwed this part up. So in the process, see all the marks on the top of that ratchet wheel? I did that. I screwed it up. It's only cosmetic, but in the process of one of the previous assemblies, disassembly, I was attempting to remove power. And so I was doing that by holding back the click spring, and I have a screwdriver on that ratchet wheel screw and slowly rotating it to allow it to unwind. And my screwdriver slipped, and I kept downward pressure on it, and I marred up the top of that ratchet wheel. Truth be told, if anyone who works on watches told you they never put a mark on a watch, they're lying, or they've never worked on a watch. You know, granted, it's been a while since I've done one even remotely that significant, but I felt it would be dishonest because that old ratchet wheel actually looked pretty pristine. That again, the problem is only cosmetic. If someone did that on a watch they were servicing, they'd give it to the customer would never know. But I'm videotaping these and putting them on the channel, and I'm brutally honest with you folks. And by the way, there's that replacement pallet fork that came out of that donor 1080. You can see the cap jewel or the stones on that pallet fork are actually kind of a clearish amber color, not red. That's it's still the same stone. And that's totally fine. Here we're trying to get that upper pivot. There we go. Seated for that. And there the pallet fork bridge goes. Now you saw it kind of sit down where it should be. So I went ahead and instead of ordering a new pallet fork for this thing, I went ahead and cleaned up the one from the donor movement. And technically, that's not even a terribly difficult fix to fix that jewel in the original pallet fork. I don't have a warming table or heating table to heat that thing up to kind of melt that shellac and readjust that jewel. I just don't. It's not even a terribly expensive or complicated tool. I just don't have one, so I just opted to replace it. Here we're applying the slightest amount of escapement lubrication to that exit stone. We'll apply that to 5 teeth at a time, and then repeat that process 2 more times, adding that lubrication to all 15 teeth. So once that's done, I had some decent microscope footage this time with the balance assembly going in. So we got a little picture-in-picture action going here. So we're going to go ahead and try to get this balance assembly in. So the view on the top left you're seeing is kind of my view through the microscope, although my field of view through the eyepiece is a little wider than what the camera picks up. So that balance is actually really in the center of my field of vision. But this thing does not want to spin at first, and I can tell that wheel's tilted, so I'm just going to kind of raise up this balance bridge and kind of seat it back down again. Yeah, there we go. Trying to be careful as I press down, and I kind of pressed too hard at one point, and stop that balance for a second, but there we go. And again, this thing here has really tight pins on the underside of that balance cock as well. So I'm just trying to work it down as best I can, but you'll still see it. It seats down quite a bit once I get the screw down, but there we go. Tighten down into place, and now we can go ahead and lubricate this thing. So there's our 4th wheel and our 3rd wheel. Everything else on the back side of the watch has already been lubricated. We'll flip the movement over and lubricate the 3rd wheel. And again, we've already kind of addressed everything else during assembly. So I'm just kind of taking a look at this thing. That the hairspring looks pretty good. That replacement balance complete seems to be pretty happy. Spinning away looks nice. So we're going to go ahead and I tried to set beat error as best I could on this thing before I assembled the watch. This is prior to any regulation, and truth be told, this is pretty darn good. That amplitude, this is just running for a couple minutes. So this is nowhere near ready, but I'm super thrilled with that. That amplitude is actually going to bump up. Yeah, see, it took a 50 or 40 or 50 degree jump right there at 287. Beat errors at 1.3. Technically, I could pretty much leave it there, 1.2, 1.3. It'd be good. Ideally, I want to get these things below 1 millisecond if possible, but adjusting the beat error on these is a pain in the rear. And the safe way to do it, if you remove the balance complete, I see which way I need to turn it. I'm turning that hairspring collet just a tiny amount. It took 2 tries, but I got it nailed. Look at that. 0.0 beat error. I'm taking it. We'll call that a win. So moving over to the dial side of the watch, begin by installing the setting lever. And it's super difficult to see. I've yet to find a really good way of showing that. That's probably the best view I've ever shot right there, but it's not great. But we get that screw tightened up, and now we can get our winding pinion and sliding clutch lubricated with some heavier grease. So I used to apply a lot more than that, and a lot of folks, rightly so, told me, "Hey, you're putting too much on there," even though I did clean a lot of it up. But and really, I guess I would only need those are two mating surfaces. They mate against each other, so really, I would only need lubrication on one side if I really think about it. Because as soon as I put the parts together and they start working, it's going to distribute that around. So this is still probably overkill, but it's not going to hurt a thing. There we go. Sliding clutch goes in. And now I'm going to apply a bit more of that heavier grease to the inside walls of this channel in here where the yoke is going to make contact with that sliding clutch and move it backwards and forwards. It actually generally doesn't touch the bottom side of that. It touches the side walls. So here's the post where the yoke is going to go. We got some oil on there, and we can get this yoke put into place and make sure it's kind of set in there into that little channel. There we go. And yeah, you can kind of see how it's going to move that thing back and forth. So the end of that yoke is going to interact with the setting lever. So when you pull the crown out, on the top right of that setting lever, you can see where it's kind of over where the crown would go, and there's a post on the underside of that. So as you pull the crown out, it rotates that setting lever and thus engages with that yoke, moving it upwards or downwards. And so I'm kind of checking to see where all those mating surfaces are between the yoke and the setting lever. And yep, right there, I think I want to add one more tiny little dab of grease to the top side on that corner right there. So when that crown gets pulled out all the way, that yoke is gonna kind of ride on top of, or setting lever rides on top of that yoke, just like that. Okay, I'm pleased with that. We'll clean up the excess grease on the top of that, and just kind of we want a little a film of it just on the contact surfaces, as best we can. Little dab of grease here where the yoke spring is going to make contact with it, so we can go ahead and get that thing put into place. This is a pretty stout little spring, actually. So I'm going to kind of use some precaution here and hold it down on one side and use my brass tweezers because I think I've already marked this movement up enough as it is. I'm going to try to avoid that as much as possible moving forward. It killed me to on that ratchet wheel too. I was like, I cannot believe I did that. I was like, and if I went and I mean, a ratchet wheels for this thing was only like $12 or $15. You know, could have got one. No one would ever have known, and there wouldn't have been a mark on it. But you know what? It's not honest. I did it. So, you know, whatever. It's just learning experience. A little bit here on that upper post for the setting lever, and that's where the setting lever spring is going to engage. And that is our replacement setting lever spring. And funny enough, you may be wondering, well, why did he go through the trouble of buying a new one when he could have just used the one off the donor movement that he got? And you're absolutely right. And the reason I bought a new one was because I started searching for a replacement setting lever spring and pallet fork before I did the thorough inspection. So had I waited, I could have just used the one off the donor movement. It was the same, but I didn't. But we're using the new one because I bought one. So here on that is our original crown. You can see that inside gasket's thrashed. It's on this one, man. It's just easier just to get a replacement crown. That original crown's not signed. And when I do a new crown, I always try to get a new stem as well. Sometimes if those crowns are a little deeper than the originals or something, you may have a spacing issue. So even though that old stem, there was a little corrosion on it, but it cleaned up quite nicely, we got a replacement stem. So we'll have to adjust that later. But for now, we can go ahead and screw the crown on it and continue on with assembly in this thing. But there is our assembled but not trimmed crown. But applying some heavy grease to a few spots on this thing where it's going to the contact surfaces for the main plate and then the setting lever, and then on each four of these square sides where it's going to ride inside that sliding clutch, and then a little on the tip there. We can go ahead and put this thing inside the movement. And since we don't have our setting lever screw tightened down yet, it just kind of slides in there. So now we can tighten that screw up, and it's going to squeeze that setting lever and that post right inside that channel. And now that is in place and everything looks to be functioning, feels quite nice. So I think we're good to go. I think we can assemble the rest of the motion work now. So we're going to lubricate the post for the minute wheel. Here's the post for the canyon pinion. And that setting gear as well. It's the first one we did. Go ahead and get our canyon pinion put on. It is a satisfying sound. Try to add the clicks in when I remember each video. A lot of folks seem to like that. Got our gear in. One side of that had kind of radius curved teeth. We put that side downwards, where the kind of radius side of the curved side of those teeth are going to engage with the sliding clutch, and then get a minute wheel put into place. And again, I tried I gave it an honest effort and put a lot of elbow grease into trying to clean up that minute wheel, and those marks are permanent. The wheel is clean, but those marks are permanent. Now we can get our cover plate put on. Here we have just kind of two, flush fit screws that hold that in place. And a little bit of HP 1300 on the outside of that cannon pinion where our hour wheel is going to go on. And yes, I do see that Rodico on top of that. I catch it before the next shot. I did see it right there as I was putting that wheel on. There we go. It's gone. And there was no dial washer on this movement prior. And especially with a curved dial, I really think it needs one because it's going to kind of keep that hour wheel downward. So put a new dial washer on this thing. And here we got our dial. I love this dial, folks. I just, the more and more I've kind of got into these old watches, the more and more I get where people like those old kind of patina dials. I'm on board. I'm in your camp now. I get it. Originally I could take it or leave it, but like, I get it. I think that's just super cool. So here, again, when I have these hands out, I'm using a mask and I'm using ventilation. I just don't want to inhale any of these particles. And in full disclosure here, I pressed this hour wheel on a bit too far where it makes contact with the dial. I did adjust that and correct that before I put the minute hand on. Now you can see it's barely sitting off the face of the watch, just barely. And if you're really curious, I did kind of go overboard and I actually washed my pushers for the hands on this machine after I was done working on these radium hands. Now comes our second sand, and just very, very light pressure. You'll see that thing kind of sit down. One more. There we go. All right. So while that watch starts to run in, we can take a look at this case and get into it.
And we must succeed. Let's make sure history never forgets the name. Enterprise. Ghana.
Well, that was weird. I don't know how that got in there. If you didn't know what I was watching or listening to in the background as I was doing this. So we got our crystal popped out, and yeah, that thing is not going to be reused. So I want to start off here and just see kind of what this corrosion looks like. And ugh, this is just depressing to watch because I started in on this and I'm seeing how it's barely kind of coming up, and I'm like, this is going to take me for freaking ever to get through. But, it's got to be done. So I'm going to go ahead and speed this up. This is, I think it's like a 25 times speed. What you see there is a pair of brass tweezers I have regulated for the sole purpose of doing this kind of work. I find that the brass isn't going to mark up steel, but it is brass tweezers is a quite effective tool to kind of get in the nooks and crannies and like the threads for the case back and all that. We're going to clean this up as much as we can and take a look at all this junk that came off that case. Now, granted, there's some pegwood in there and whatnot, but that kind of gives you an idea. So, haven't really shown any ultrasonic footage on here. What I like to do, just take some simple green. I find to be a pretty effective primary cleaning solution on this stuff. Got this heated up to about 50 degrees Celsius. I'm going to drop our movement ring in, or our movement ring, the dust cover, the case back and the case front. clean it a few times. We're still going to have some pitting, obviously, with all that rust, but I think we got all the rust out eventually after a few cleaning cycles and a few more, you know, scrubbing cycles and all that. We got it in. So right now we're compressing and squeezing this crystal a little bit to reduce the outside diameter. We're going to raise the case up and kind of let it fit inside that groove, and then we'll go ahead and release tension on this crystal. It'll expand back out and fill the groove, and we have a replacement crystal. So now we can go ahead and get this thing installed on there. And this is honestly, that's one of my favorite shots in every video, is just the shot of that dial and case being married. I just love that for whatever reason. And as you can see here, I mean, it looks pretty rough because you saw all that rust. We do have some pitting. The first thing I did once I got all the rust out and all that, and all the marks, I just found, I mean, all the threads are clear. It threads on nicely. The case back does and everything. So we're still good to go. I'm going to go ahead and install this movement ring in there, and I'm going to obstruct the camera a little bit, but the footage on the other camera was blurry because apparently I forgot how the focus button works. So I'm going to cover up my work here for just a second, but there we go. We got that in. And I went to put the crown back in. I honestly forgot at this point. I was pressing it. I'm like, oh yeah, we got to trim it. So we're going to measure the gap here and just kind of see with it in and the screw set in place and it's in its full position, what the gap is between the crown and the case. And it looks like 2.2 millimeters, give or take. So we can go ahead and remove the crown from the stem. Take your time. And what I like to do, obviously we're going to need to trim this back, but if you trim it too far, it's a one-shot thing. You can work your way towards it, but you don't want to overshoot it. So I'm applying some Sharpie to just shy of where I know it's going to be. So I know this cut's actually going to be short. And I do this process a few times. I kind of trim it on an Arkansas stone, clean up the threads a little bit so it can thread back on, test fit it, remeasure it, and just inch my way towards it. So it took a total of 3 adjustments to get the crown where I liked it, basically. But what you're seeing here is just the full process for each attempt. But once we get it trimmed all the way back, here we have a good fitting crown. So the last thing I'm going to do, once I'm happy with it, we got to pull it out one more time. Releasing the screw and go ahead and pulling it out. Disassembling it again. But we want to affix this with a little bit of thread locker. I like using this blue Loctite. This is not permanent Loctite, but it will not come off unless you really want it to. Applying heat makes it a bit easier. The red Loctite's permanent. I don't like to use that on crowns. Just kind of removing the excess. Now you can kind of see the amount of thread locker I've got on there. So go ahead and reattach this one more time and thread that crown in place. And what I want to do now is just kind of clean up that excess thread locker that's visible. So Rodico does a brilliant job of that. Just kind of work my way around it. And I'm going to apply some silicone grease to that gasket on the inside of that watch. Could also apply it to the outside of the crown tube, but I just like doing it this way. And for the last time, thankfully, we can put this crown and stem back in the watch. So clicks into place quite nicely, and we can go ahead and tighten that screw down. Now we have our dust cover, and that forms a really tight seal with that movement ring. And actually, during disassembly, that movement ring and that came out as a single unit. It almost looked like one part, but they do separate. Lastly, we have a fresh gasket, and I actually went and used a slightly thicker gasket for the back of this thing, just taking into account what pitting is there and all that. I didn't want any of that I wanted to use about the thickest gasket that I could get away with. Hopefully it would kind of fill in any potential, the access for moisture or air to get in. So I got a nice thick gasket of the correct size. I'm going to go ahead and set that on the case back. And now I'm just working this thing around to make sure it's completely flat all the way around. Because if it's twisted or it rides up on its side and kind of goes vertical when you go to screw it in. It could kink that gasket and basically it would fail in its intended purpose. But we have that and a good amount of silicone grease on there, so it's nice and supple. And we can go ahead and put this case back on. Rodico makes a pretty handy little handle to do that. Now we want to tighten it up. So this is a cheaper version of a more expensive tool, but works great. And if you're interested in learning watchmaking, check out the description in the video. I give you a link to a Google document where I detail the tools I use with notes on each one, what's expensive, what's not, what you can get away with, in my opinion, what it's worth spending the money on. There is some affiliate links in there. Anything with an Amazon link is an affiliate link. Several of them are not, but that's just the equipment that I'm using. This tool's in there too, but if you're kind of curious about what I use, cameras or watchmaking tools, that stuff is in there. So special shout out here to Lucas, my buddy Lucas. I had a few different strap options for this thing. This strap here I've had on a previous watch. I ended up selling the watch a while back to fund a future project, but I kept the strap. I sent him a couple pictures. I'm like, hey, which one do you like? And he said he liked this one the best, and he gave me option number 2. So I like this the best. I actually put a picture up on Instagram and on the community page Facebook. A lot of people really thought this strap fit the watch good. That was Lucas's eye. And so thanks, Lucas. And by the way, if you like Instagram, you can check me out there. There's a link on your screen. But ladies and gentlemen, here's how the watch turned out. I really like it. I'm sold on these old vintage Doxas and on these old vintage watches. I just think they're beautiful. This thing here sure took me for a ride, an emotional roller coaster, a lot of repairs, a lot of trying to solve problems. Some I created, some I didn't, but I think in the end, it turned out well. So ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoyed this video, if you think I've earned it, I really would appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. It's a crazy world we're living in nowadays. You know, the world seems to be falling apart if you watch the news on a daily basis. But, this is my escape. And if you enjoy watching these videos, it gives you a little break from the reality that we're all living in day to day. Then, I'm certainly glad you're here. So thanks again. Take care of yourselves and each other. Be safe, and we will see you on the next video soon. See ya.